Good evening, everyone. Just hang on tight while I get everything set up. I'll be getting started shortly. Hey, Circuit Man. Actually, no. And just bear with me. I'm putting up links and all the other necessities of doing the show. Sorry for the fact we perpetually start late. Okay, we're ready to go. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of the Paranormal Encyclopedia. Tonight, I'm going to do a topic I've been meaning to do for a while, actually. I'm going to start talking about magic, religion, and science, and how the three of them interrelate. This will probably be a longer topic than just one night, but I want to get started on it because I think it's very interesting and often a little surprising. What people think of how the three of them relate or don't relate is a lot more complicated. It was usually a lot simpler than the reality is. Before I do that, as a matter of housekeeping, I want to apologize if anybody missed the messages on my Facebook about last week. I was unfortunately on the way back from the Catskills when more than half of the lug nuts on my car snapped off, and we got stuck up there for an extra day getting it fixed. By the time the dust settled and I was in the hotel room again, it just was too late and I was too exhausted to be able to do the show. We do, on the other hand, have a recorded interview with the very talented storyteller Lilith Thor and her husband that will be editing and putting up soon. And I do have the video footage of 100 candles. Hopefully we'll be putting that up. We need to look it over first because the reality is we were battling a band, as it were, so the noise is pretty bad. But okay, so housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about religion, science, and magic. Now, today when people think of religion, particularly Christianity, and science, they tend to think of them as opposing forces. You look at ev- evolution versus creationism, Big Bang versus creationism. People tend to think religion doesn't fit well into science. These days, that's become more true, particularly with more fundamentalist sects. Historically, no, not at all. Up until the 20th century, actually, no, that's not quite fair. Up until about the Enlightenment period, and even to some extent the Renaissance, although not as much. Most scientists were deeply religious men. Some of the most important people in scientific history were religious men, and quite a few of them were actually magicians in one sense or another. A real good example of this, we'll all remember from high school geometry class, I'm sure, is Pythagoras. Pythagoras is the guy with the famous equation, squared plus b squared equals c squared with triangles. Yeah, he was actually kind of a cult leader and magician and claimed to have magical powers. He was a philosopher, and yeah, he was a mathematician as well. But I mean, this is going back to ancient Greece, and a lot of, for that matter, the origins of scientific thought and the idea of the scientific method start in Greece as well, particularly with Aristotle. And again, you're dealing with philosophers. You're talking about people that were generally religious. And then here's another one people tend to misunderstand in this history is, Rome eventually becomes the dominant driving force. Rome's destroyed. For the three people that'll ever watch this that don't realize this, because I think most, again, as I've said many times, I tend to think most of my listeners are pretty smart people. But for the record, Christianity did not destroy the Roman Empire. In reality, Christianity is why the Roman Empire continued to exist as long as it did. And keep in mind as well, people tend to think of the sacking of Rome by the Vandals. And I want to say the 4th century? I'd have to look that up. But it was the end of the Roman Empire. It's not. The Roman Empire shifted to the east, to Byzantium and Constantinople, and continued to exist for hundreds of years. So this idea that the reality was the Roman Empire had gotten too large and was starting to collapse, and yeah, you're talking about the 5th century is when things kind of fell apart. Christianity managed to help stabilize it. Most historians generally seem to think that the empire would have collapsed a lot sooner, just because it had gotten too large and its own internal problems were tearing it apart. There's also some speculation that lead-lined pipes might have had something to do with it, poisoning the water supplies. I honestly don't know. I'm not enough of a Roman historian to say the deals there. But the thing is, Rome falls to the Goths and the Vandals and all these other various barbarian tribes, and a lot of records get ruined with it, unfortunately. But on the other hand, a bunch of them survive. And let's keep in mind, in the Middle East, a lot of the Roman records were preserved by Muslims. Despite what a lot of modern people think, the modern society owes a great deal to the Islamic world. They helped us. They developed languages. They developed algebra. They developed modern paper. They did a lot of important things, and they helped preserve a lot of these records. In Europe, though, particularly Western Europe, the Muslims weren't the ones who maintained these records. Catholic priests and monks were. They were sitting. A lot of the reasons we still have the records of Plato and Aristotle and people like that are because of these Catholic monks who kept diligent records that spent pretty much all of their time copying things. So that's again, from the beginning, And obviously because I'm a Christian, and my biggest area of expertise is more Christian history than other religious history. I'm going to focus on Christianity's relationship with science and magic, for that matter. We're getting there, but the other religions have had these kinds of roles too. But let's talk a little bit as well about the relationship between magic and science, for that matter. Historically speaking, again, up until about the same period, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, most people who were what we consider scientists were magicians. The big example everyone usually thinks of is that chemistry came out of alchemy. Alchemy is a very religious or a very magical system. It's not. Its interests are spiritual and philosophical. They are not scientific. There are three goals in alchemy, actually, in point of fact, traditionally. One, the purification of metal. This is what everybody thinks of with, turning lead into gold. There's a whole school of thought in alchemy that all metals are gold. It's just the less valuable metals have impurities in them. If you can clean out all the impurities, you get gold. So, at least you can get something more valuable. Ironically enough, of the three goals of alchemy, this is the one that science actually has managed to do. Using a nuclear accelerator, it is actually possible to turn lead into gold. It's not a very good idea because, in point of fact, what will happen is you get radioactive gold that breaks down very quickly, but you can actually make lead into gold using nuclear physics. So the second goal is the creation of life. The homunculus. Homunculus was a little human, usually, that was created by alchemy. If you've ever seen the old black and white Bride of Frankenstein movie, you'll see a couple of them. Supposedly, again, according to medieval texts, to create a homunculus, you mixed your own blood with semen, believe it or not. Yeah, alchemy, and here's the thing, alchemy actually worked like a science. They tested things. They came up with theories, they tested things. Their inherent theories and hypotheses were wrong, but they were actually endeavoring to be scientific. And the other thing I was trying to get at here is what makes it less science and more magic is the intentions. Because the central goal of all alchemy, what really makes it spiritual, is immortality. It was believed that just as I said earlier about how you made lead into gold by removing impurities. Well, they believed that humans were meant to be immortal. You just had to remove the physical and spiritual impurities from the body, and then eventually you would live forever. And everything they were doing was based on this idea of purification, of cleansing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. The science was inherently flawed, but they actually did work in a very scientific manner, and a lot of their discoveries and a lot of their ideas would later form the foundations of modern chemistry. For that matter, Francis Bacon and Roger Bacon, and so again, some of the important minds that helped form our modern idea of the scientific method were alchemists. Actually, a lot of the important scientists of this period in history were alchemists. Another related one that gets mixed up to some extent is astrology. And people tend to think of, astrology formed the basis of astronomy. Yes and no. The thing with is there was basically a couple of different ways they used astrology. The way that we think of astrology today is is over 2,000 years old. It comes from the Greeks and it comes from Babylon. The irony, of course, being that the whole idea of your sun sign, the sun, the place that the constellation the sun rises on your birthday, is about 2,000 years wrong. Because when these ideas were originally come up with, the sun, would appear to rise in one set of constellations, in the 12 signs of the zodiac. 2,000 years later, space moved. It doesn't rise in the same constellation anymore. So, as I understand it, basically, whatever you think your sign is, you're off one. Because, no, that's not where at this time the sun doesn't rise there. And in 1,000 or 2,000 more years, it'll be wrong again. But there was definitely a side section of what we call astrology that was concerned more with plotting where the comets were coming, where stars and moons and planets and all these other things were, largely in part because of they thought they had various cosmic significance, but because, if you believe that a comet is a herald of a great disaster coming or great change, it helps to know when it's coming back. The Aztecs in particular were very good at mapping out celestial changes a long time into the future, which leads into the utterly ridiculous nonsense of people who thought the Mayan calendar ended in 2012. As you all may have noticed, the world didn't end in 2012. I mean, it's 2016 and we're all still here. Unless the world ended and I missed the memo. I hate when that happens. The reality being that the Mayan calendar is a wheel. When you reach the end of the wheel, you start over again. It never ended. The whole thing was based on stupid people who didn't know, who were not archaeologists or in any other way familiar with Mayan society, culture, or the Mayan calendar. Really, the Mayan calendar, who made a bunch of stupid assumptions. One of these days I am going to do an entire episode just on people trying to predict the end of the world, because there's so many really funny examples of people who were absolutely convinced the world was going to end, and how many times they've been wrong. I mean, I've survived, I'm 40, I've survived probably a couple of dozen by this point. I know I've survived at least 5 or 6 in the last couple of years. Which is actually leads somewhat roundabout to a relatively funny gentleman by the name of Michel de Nostradamus. Of course, made a bunch of failed predictions. He's another topic worth discussing, in the fact that, no, he got pretty much everything wrong, despite what the very imaginative people want to say. But he was an astrologer, he was a scryer using a bowl of water to try and predict the future. And he was actually a doctor, which is something that tends to get overlooked. He deserves some credit because he was among the few doctors of the day that was willing to work with plague victims. And again, particularly when you talk about the relationship of magic and science, aside from chemistry, historical medicine has a lot to do with magical practice. Going back to ancient times, there's the use of herbs. For that matter, the idea of the 4 humors, that your blood, your bile, your phlegm. But basically, that the 4 humors come out of balance, and you have to drain them to bring the person back into balance, usually through bloodletting, either using leeches or just simply cutting the person open. The reality, of course, being leeches actually do have some useful chemicals in their saliva, whereas bloodletting just killed people. And for that matter, it's important to note, while this idea goes back to ancient Greece, it was actually an alchemist who first started to go, no, this is wrong, and proposed that we needed to rethink our theories about the origin of disease. I'm just double checking because I'm going to give his name, but I want to be sure I have the right one. Actually, yes, I was right. Paracelsus. It was kind of arrogant. His name, there's an earlier Greek philosopher by the name of Celsus, of course, and he thought he was superior. So he called himself para, as in beyond Celsus, above, superior to Celsus. He did a lot of important discoveries in terms of treatment. He created laudanum, which became very popular in the 19th century. He made a bunch of important chemical notices, and for that matter, he's considered the father of the science of toxicology. He wrote Sola Dostis Facit Veninum. The dose makes the poison, which is actually a very good point. But basically, what he was saying is what is poisonous or what is dangerous to the body comes down to the dosage. There are things in this, and people don't realize it, but virtually everything you can think of in this world, water, oxygen, just about everything, can be extremely toxic if you get too much of it. I've even had this argument trying to explain to people, no, that actually is true. And there are a number of other things, for that matter, that there are toxins in nature that in high doses are very, very fatal, but in lower, more controlled doses can be life-saving. A common example of which would be digitalis. Digitalis, also known as foxglove, is at one time widely used in heart medication. What's interesting is if you eat the plant foxglove in wild, it's poisonous. It can kill you. We figured out if you refine it, though, it actually is an effective heart medication. What's interesting and slightly unrelated, but I think worth mentioning because it relates to the naturalistic fallacy, which I want to talk about in a second, that we now have figured out ways to synthesize digitalis, and the synthetic version is safer than the natural version. There's a widespread misconception that, there's two widespread misconceptions in alternative medicine, and I loathe calling it that because most of it really isn't medicine. It's nonsense. But there's what's called the naturalistic fallacy, which is the belief that just because it's natural makes it better, which is idiotic. Like I just said, foxglove, natural form, very poisonous, can and will kill you if you just eat the plant. Refine it, and you have a drug that will actually might save you from a heart attack. Make it, but it still has side effects. Make it in a lab. Don't use the actual plant, but synthesize it, and it's safer than the derivative of the plant. Anything, realistically speaking, and this goes back to Paracelsus's point, anything that has any kind of meaningful effect is going to have side effects. Anyone who tells you this has no side effects is saying it doesn't work. Sometimes people will say, well, if you just take the herb or whatever, it's less side effects. And yeah, sometimes that's true, which is often simply because it's less of a dose, which may work fine depending on whatever you need. But also the reality there being that it's still an active chemical and it may still have side effects. It will still probably have side effects, and it may also interact with other drugs that you're taking. So assuming it's safe because it's natural is dangerous. There's also the common mistake that just because it's been around, people have been doing it for thousands of years, it must work. There's lots of things people have been doing for thousands of years that don't do anything. Case in point, the idea of cutting people open and to drain the blood out goes back to ancient Greece. And nobody's going to suggest that we should take up bloodletting again. Because we realized real quickly when we stopped doing it, more patients are living when we just ignore them than when we cut them open and let the blood out. Ancient doesn't mean better. So, okay, that's a little bit about magic and science. I want to come back to that and particularly look at quantum theory and magic, because that gets very interesting. I want to talk a little bit about, I believe that Drew and I have talked about this on the show before. I want to talk about one of the most biggest misconceptions, even outright lies, about the history of science and religion. Galileo Galilei, and his persecution by the Roman Catholic Church. Dear crap, do people not understand what actually happened? And there's a reason people don't understand what happened. See, the thing is, in the United States, there's a very large bias against the Roman Catholic Church. Has been pretty much since we were founded. This is, and let's be clear, I'm not saying non-Christians have a huge bias against the Catholic Church. Other Christians have had historically a huge bias against the Roman Catholic Church. Specifically, I'm talking here about the conflict between Protestant and Catholic, not atheist and religious. But Galileo came up with it. First of all, Galileo didn't really come up with a theory. The theory was Copernicus's. Copernicus said that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is the center of the universe. In point of fact, they're both wrong, insofar as there is no center of the universe. The sun is. We now know the sun is the center of the solar system, and we now know that the Earth orbits the sun. But the original central point, which was the sun is the center of everything, is in fact wrong. The universe being infinite in size has no meaningful center. Probably. Then again, there's all sorts of theories about that. But he republishes Copernicus's theories. Now, at first, again, despite what people think, at first he was actually really well received by he was well received by the Catholic Church. He was invited by the Pope to come talk about his theories in the Vatican. His theories were used by Copernicus's theories were used by Pope Gregory XIII when he reformed the calendar in 1582. These ideas were not necessarily hated. But he was invited to speak at the Vatican. He went. His theories were actually very well received, including by the Pope at the time, and the man who would later become the Pope when he was... hold on a second. Okay, so... he was... Let me just... So under Gregory XV, he was invited to the Vatican. Then, and a cardinal at the time, who was actually a friend of his, Maffeo Barberini, would later take the throne as Pope Urban VIII. The whole persecution of Galileo happened under Urban VIII. But here's the thing. So Galileo is publishing this theory, and he claims he has some evidence for it. A couple of things. One is that using his telescope, which he didn't actually invent, by the way, he just got credit for it. He discovered moons of Jupiter. He noticed the way that the shadows crossed the moons, and he considered this evidence. He also claimed that, and here's one of the things he was fundamentally wrong about, is he thought that the tides were caused by the sun and by our passage around the sun. Children know this is wrong. But again, the church was interested. Most of the other scientists of the time were interested. The problem he got was he started publishing these theories that he couldn't prove. And yes, we now know they're fact. At the time, we didn't know they were fact. They were just theory. And in 1616, the Inquisition decided to have a little chat with him over the situation. And pretty much they told him, dude, chill. Oh, and this was under Paul V, apparently. Stop publishing theories that you can't prove as if they were reality. And he kept doing it anyway. Now, again, it's usually painted that what happened is the church threw a fit. Oh, and I got backwards. I'm sorry. It's no, I had it right. No, never mind. That the church threw a fit and persecuted him. No, the scientific community threw a fit. And at this point, the model of the universe wasn't what people think. Today, it wasn't, well, the Earth is in the center and everything orbits the Earth. It's the Earth is in the center, the Sun orbits the Earth, everything else orbits the Sun. The first problem is his theories, his evidence fit that theory just as well as it fit his own. And ultimately what happens is that he's asked by Urban VIII, who, again, friend of his, liked him, in fact, Galileo traveled to Rome to congratulate him on being named Pope. But at the church's request, he publishes a dialogue. It's called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It was published in 1632. And it's a conversation between Salviati, who is a Copernican scientist who basically agrees with Galileo, and Sagredo, and another scientist called Simplico, who supported the widely accepted theory of the time. So his first mistake is, Simplico would be simpleton, who in fact was shown to be a follower of Ptolemy and Aristotle, which were the predominant minds that everyone was looking to for their theories. And yes, in Italian, Simplico is simple, or as in simple-minded. Whereas Salviati is marked as very wise and scholarly and very called the academician. So that's his first mistake. Is he basically, and he pretty much does a straw man argument, and makes the mysterious blunder of using quotes from a number of prominent cardinals and other major political figures within the church for the simpleton, which is seen as extremely insulting. The church can't allow this, particularly because basically he's seen as having just insulted the Pope, which was not a smart position. The man, they were friends. The Pope liked him. The Pope was trying to keep him out of trouble. And he went back in front of the Inquisition in 1633. No, he wasn't tortured. He was threatened with torture, but they never actually tortured him. And on June 22nd, 1633, he is found guilty. Specifically, he was found guilty of vehemently suspect of heresy. His sentence was imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition, which translates to, the next day was translated into house arrest, which basically meant he got to go live out the rest of his life in a beautiful mansion, hold parties, have visitors, and he was allowed to travel as long as somebody went with him. And then the dialogue in question was banned by the Catholic Church. A ban that would last for some time. And here's the thing. He kept publishing the book. He kept publishing the dialogue concerning the two major world systems. The church knew he kept publishing it. The church really didn't give a damn. He continued to travel. He continued to write. He continued to work on his theories. And in point of fact, the reality is one of his most important books was written after he was thrown in prison. Now, people will sometimes go, oh, well, you're just repeating Catholic propaganda. How do you know all this? Here's the thing. If you want, there's a very good book called Galileo's Daughter. And it's a series of letters written between him and his eldest daughter, Virginia, also known as Sister Maria Celeste, who was a Catholic nun. And you can get his perspective on what actually happened. The ideas, the things that you're running into are not, again, a lot of what we're dealing with here is propaganda that was started by the Protestants because of the long-time issue with the Roman Catholic Church, which goes back to Martin Luther. Did Galileo get in trouble? Yeah, he did. Mainly he got in trouble for two things. One, for being a giant ass, and the other for publishing unproven theory as if it was scientific fact. Modern scientists aren't real keen on people doing this today. And yes, it's very easy to go, well, but we know that he was right. Ish, because we know that the Earth is not the center of the solar system. The Sun is. But at the time, they didn't know that. He had evidence, and again, one of his evidences was fundamentally wrong. And again, school children know better. But that's kind of hindsight is 20/20 to say, oh well, he knew he was right, everyone else was wrong. It was wrong, horrible what happened to him. He didn't have, he didn't have that rough a time of it. For a sentence from the Inquisition, go live in your nice house for the rest of your life was pretty darn good, especially when the man was never tortured. Yeah, that's the real story of Galileo, and a direct first-hand source if you want to get it from the horse's mouth instead of listening to me drone on and on and on. Let's talk about the big one, the two big ones: evolution and the Big Bang. Both of which have a really complicated history with Christianity. So, as everyone knows, Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of the Species, when did he publish the book? I'm looking it up. There we go. But basically, Darwin goes on a trip to the Galapagos Islands, makes a number of observations, and develops his theory of evolution. In point of fact, he's one of two people to publish a similar theory. His ship was the Beagle, landed, but when it first comes out, people get pissed. Because Darwin's saying that we're all descendants. Common misconception, and I'm not an evolutionary biologist, though I'm looking to try and get one on the show so they can talk about this because they're more informed about it than I am. But basically, he says that humans and modern gorillas and chimpanzees and other primates have a common ancestor. Despite what people think, despite what people who are not familiar with the actual theories think, he didn't say, and evolution doesn't say that we're descended from chimps. We and chimps are descended from the same ancestor. Way back. Chimpanzees are the closest modern relative, but less grandpa, more uncle. But Darwin made these observations. The science community was actually kind of in an uproar as well. The religious community is in an uproar. Debate begins to rage. And eventually, of course, modern science now pretty much universally accepts evolution as the means by which life came about, particularly how life complex life like humans came about. Here's the interesting thing, though. All through this, the Roman Catholic Church didn't give a formal position. Sure, there are lots of Catholics who gave opinions on it, but till about 1950, there was no, this is what Catholic doctrine says on the subject. Despite what everybody thinks. It was in 1950 that Pope Pius XII, who's a very interesting figure in his own right, and particularly his actions during the Holocaust, but Pope Pius XII said of evolution that he thought it deserved more investigation, and he saw he was skeptical. He said he was skeptical of it, but that he didn't see any conflict between the theory of evolution and Christian doctrine and the Bible. Although he did caution that he did not feel that the theory of evolution should encroach upon spiritual matters. Specifically, he was saying that science and evolution ended at the point when man becomes ensouled, when we gain a soul. And in fairness, in defense of his point, the soul is a spiritual concept. It's not a scientific one. The two don't pretty much exist separately of each other. I'm trying to find the actual quote of what he said. Of course, later on, Pope John II, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict XVI have all reaffirmed this opinion that we need to that evolution is in fact in keeping with Catholic doctrine, that there's no reason that the two can't peacefully coexist. At this point, it is basically almost catechism. Because the science, and it's a thing to realize as well, the Catholic Church in particular, and to be fair, there are plenty of Protestants that are this way too, but we're talking about the largest denomination of Christianity in the world here, folks. Before everybody assumes that Christians don't accept science, you need to keep in mind, biggest denomination in the world has been encouraging and accepting of evolution for more than 50 years. And that's not even the real nail in the coffin of this anti-science idea. The real nail in the coffin is even older than that. 1929, I'm going to look it up. And starts with a radical idea in cosmology. Cosmology being the study of how the universe began. Or in this case specifically, we're talking about the study of how the universe began. But at any rate, this gentleman by the name of Georges Lemaitre proposes a completely radical theory that, at the time, the scientific community scoffed at. They thought it was because up until this theory, the main prevailing theory of how the universe started was known as the steady state universe. The steady state universe says the universe is the way it is. It doesn't change. It's always been this way. It will always be this way. It's steady state. And this was very popular, particularly with atheists and agnostics, because religion says God created the universe. If you say the universe had no beginning, there's no creation, there's no God. The problem being, of course, we now know better. Because the theory that I'm talking about, that was suggested by Georges Lemaitre, would of course be the Big Bang. And here's the kicker. Georges Lemaitre had a title. Aside from the fact that Georges Lemaitre was a very good physicist, he was a Catholic priest. He was a Belgian Catholic priest. So specifically, in fact, he was working for the Vatican Observatory, which, by the way, is one of the oldest scientific institutions in the world. According to this, he was working for the Catholic University of Louvain. He had a PhD from MIT. He was particularly a big deal in applying Einstein's theory of relativity to physics. And here's the kicker and the funny part. So the Christians supposedly hate science, and we reject this theory. Einstein originally rejected the Big Bang. The really funny part of that is Einstein admitted his own theory supported the Big Bang. His own equations said that he was right. And Einstein didn't want to accept it because of his beliefs. And this was it wasn't just Einstein. In general, the atheists and agnostic scientists of the time rejected the Big Bang because their preconceived notions that the universe was steady state and unchanging conflicted with this idea that, no, wait, the universe had a beginning. And it was a Catholic priest that figured it out. Now, on the other hand, here's what becomes interesting. The Catholic Church's response, the Pope wanted to adopt it as part of Catholic dogma at the time. He wanted to say, this is how God created the universe. He didn't, and actually, in point of fact, that was Georges Lemaitre's suggestion, because he felt that it was dangerous to make scientific theory and the religious catechism. I am inclined to agree with him, just because science is and should be more flexible than religion in terms of changing, because science is based on the best evidence. If tomorrow they find a better theory that better fits the origins of the universe, science will eventually adopt it. But there's another good example, and before I feel like I'm harping on Catholicism in particular, I'm going to hop to another really important scientific figure who's not a Roman Catholic in a bit. So I've talked all about physics, I've talked about evolution, let's talk genetics. Now, there's an idea that when Darwin came up with his Origin of the Species and his theories of evolution, he proposed what he called preeminence to explain what we now would call genetics. Here's the kicker. He was wrong. And he was fundamentally wrong. On the other hand, a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel came up with what are called the laws of inheritance. His laws of inheritance are the basis of modern genetics. And yet again, Gregor Johann Mendel, who wrote about, did this in 1865 and 1866, was also a Catholic monk, in fact. Where he came up with his theory by observing the growth of plants at his monastery, and watching the way that they interacted when they were crossbred and things of that nature. But his theory wasn't as popular, and people chose to go with the theories of Charles Darwin till about 1900, when it was rediscovered. Again, incredibly important theory, sort of ignored in favor of one that, I don't know. I can't. Unlike the Big Bang, I can't say that religion played a role here, but it was ignored in favor of an agnostic's ideas. And now we realize, oh no, wait, he was right to begin with. But genetics is another good one to talk about religion and its relationship with science. Because here's the thing. One of the most important scientific works of the 20th century, in the 21st century, I think we can all agree, is the Human Genome Project. Yeah, the attempt to map human genetics. Now, the guy who ran that for many years, who's actually a very important person in science in general, he was the director of the Human Genome Project. He's currently the head of the National Institute of Health. He's one of the most respected scientists of today, of the 20th and 21st centuries. Would be a guy by the name of Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a devout evangelical Christian, in point of fact. Now, it's important to say that, like the Catholic Church, Francis Collins is firmly behind the theory of evolution, and one of his primary goals as an evangelical is trying to explain to other evangelicals and Christians in general that you need to stop rejecting the science. The science is good. You just got to deal with that and move on. There's an idea I tend to agree with that I'm sure he would agree with, that was proposed by Galileo, when Galileo said that when our understanding of the Bible and our understanding of science, when the science says that our understanding of the Bible is wrong, instead of saying the science is wrong, we should rethink our understanding of the Bible. And that tends to be my theory. Is I believe the Bible is inspired by the Word of God. I do believe, when understood properly, it's correct. The problem is, understood properly is a major issue here. We're humans, our understanding is finite. Sometimes we get it wrong. I don't see religion as being in conflict with science. Because here's the thing. If you believe, as I do, and I think most religious people do, that the universe has an inherent order to it that was created by a set of rules, that and that's very biblical, certainly, then it seems logical to me that we should be able to understand these rules. That's what I see science as. It's an attempt to understand the underlying rules by which God built into the universe. There's, to quote my friend, the late Father Joe, God is not afraid of the microscope. Religious people should not reject science just because they see it as conflicting with their religious beliefs. I would also argue that people like Richard Dawkins, and don't get me wrong, Richard Dawkins is a very good scientist. I'm not going to denigrate his work as a evolutionary biologist. I think the guy's an asshole, but he's an excellent scientist. And you can be an asshole and be an excellent scientist. The two are not mutually exclusive. But the point I'm making is I think he's very wrong in his efforts to exclude religion from science, or to imply the two are in any way inherently conflicting. My argument, simply put, would be that religion doesn't have a place in science. Atheism doesn't have a place in science. Any good science isn't based on inductive reasoning. For anyone who's unfamiliar, there's basically two general types of reasoning. In terms of logic, there is what's called inductive and deductive. In inductive reasoning, you start with your conclusion and you go off to prove it. This is really common with intelligent design. And atheists are just as guilty of it. Where you start out with, the Bible is absolutely, literally true. The world was really created in exactly 6 days. I'm going to go prove that. Deductive is the other way around. It's what Darwin did. You go out and you make observations. You make a hypothesis to explain what you've observed. And then you make your theory based on observation, not the other way. You make your hypothesis technically in science based on observation. The reason why deductive is better than inductive is called confirmation bias. If you go out looking to prove something, subconsciously, without even meaning to, you're going to ignore evidence that suggests you're wrong and put a greater emphasis on evidence that says you're right. This is why an absolute belief in God's existence or God's non-existence has no place in science. Science should simply be concerned with what is observable. If someday, hypothetically, we found proof of the existence of God, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, I personally think it's unlikely, good science should accept it, where bad science should not. This is the difference. This is the point I'm trying to make here. The Big Bang got a negative reaction because it didn't fit somebody's preconceived notion. This doesn't work. This isn't good. And again, legitimate science is deductive. For those of you who don't remember, to run through real quick the scientific method from high school. You make observations, you make a hypothesis to explain your observation, you test your hypothesis, and then you test it again, and you test it again, and then you get other people to test it. And if the hypothesis makes accurate predictions about the tests, if it says, well, if this happens, if this and that, and it's right, then eventually, after a lot of retesting, you can develop a theory. You have what's called a theory, which is a widely misused term. In science, a theory is not just an idea that somebody came up with. To qualify as a theory, you actually need to be able to prove it to a degree. It has to actually have value. You can't just, a lot of people use theory to mean in scientific terms is actually hypothesis. But if something in science is a theory, that there is actually proof to support it. And it's another misconception that people have, including I think some people who are pro-science, that theories are immutable. They're not. Even in scientific terms, they're not. Science, good science, the reality is there are bad scientists out there, both religious and non, where this isn't true, but science as a discipline, when it's doing its job, if tomorrow somebody actually managed to come up with a better theory than evolution, with more evidence, science would eventually adopt that theory. They'd want to test it and 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 then test it some more. But as long, no theory in science is sacred. No theory in science is not, people say sometimes about climate change or evolution or things like that it's not up to debate, and that's wrong. I don't mean to imply that those theories are bad theories. My point is that if it's a theory in science, it's up to debate. That's the nature of science. Anyone who tells you that something in a scientific principle, theory, or idea is inviolate, you're thinking like a religious person. And a bad religious person in that. Because, no, in science, it should be open to debate. And reality speaking, and even in religion, theology is up to debate constantly. There are endless texts through the Middle Ages of people arguing about various points in philosophy and theology, including among Christians of the same denomination. I would argue that science, religion, and magic don't have to conflict. In fact, I haven't gotten to it, but I'll get to it in a minute, about physics or quantum physics specifically, and magic and the psychic. But, these ideas don't have to conflict. You can be religious and you can be a scientist. You can be an atheist and you can be a scientist. You just have to keep the two separated. And keep the open mind to go where the evidence takes you, wherever it takes you. I did want to talk a little bit about quantum theory. Quantum theory is incredibly weird. I'd love to get a quantum physicist on here because I don't understand it. Then again, I'm not sure how many people... There aren't all that many people in the world that do understand it, I think. What's interesting, though, is it makes a lot of statements about how reality is defined by observation. There's things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that by observing something you change it, which certainly on a subatomic level seems to be true. For to observe, for example, an electron, you have to alter the electron in some way because you're going to have to use something. You're going to have to use some other particle to mark its position, and to do that, you're going to change. If you're trying to mark its position, you're going to change its speed. If you're trying to note its speed, you're going to change its position. You can't get both answers at the same time. Not to mention the utter bizarrety that is light, and the way that photons both behave as particles and waves, depending on the circumstances. I do not remember it well enough to explain it, but I highly encourage everybody to look up the slit experiment with photons, which is just, again, utterly bizarre. There's a theory in physics that what happens to one thing in one end of the universe can affect something else. The distance, Einstein called quantum physics spooky action at a distance. Basically, at the subatomic level, things get really weird. Now, the thing is that magicians have been saying some of these things for literally thousands of years. And science is starting to catch up. The argument you'll often hear, because a real common issue you run into is the idea of psychic abilities, telepathy, remote viewing, things of that nature. And supposedly they conflict with the idea that they even work is an inherent conflict with our understanding of physics. It's not. There are theories certainly within quantum physics that would account for telepathy and remote viewing very nicely. The kind of argument you get, because yes, I've had this argument with atheists and skeptics before, is, well, the subatomic level doesn't affect, supposedly the subatomic level and the macro universe are separate. One doesn't necessarily affect, what's true in one place doesn't affect the other place. What happens in one place doesn't affect the other place. That's not actually true. So, as I said, photons, light, can be particles and waves. Now, a single photon is a subatomic part. We're talking about the micro-universe. We're talking about the subatomic universe. Or at least the atomic universe. I probably should have looked that up to be more certain. The point is, it's not part of a single photon is not part of the macro universe. The human retina is. We know because of testing, the human retina is capable of responding to one photon. So what happens on one scale can affect the other scale. This doesn't prove psychic abilities, but it does mean that we actually have workable theories that can explain them without completely rewriting our entire understanding of science. We just have to accept that the two sides of existence interrelate in a more complicated way than we previously thought. And I'm sorry if anyone who's spent any time reading up on quantum physics should realize that it's incredibly weird. Let's see. Well, there was something else I was going to point out, which also, of course, goes into many worlds hypothesis and. Man, you guys are quiet tonight. What is with you anymore? Hello? Anyone alive out there in the chat? Because I've kind of run out of steam at the moment. There's more I want to say, and I need to do a little more research before I do. But again, science, religion, magic, the three are related. The three have always... Oh, for that matter, there's something I haven't even really talked about. Magic and religion. So I talked about magic and science. I talked about religion and science. What about magic and religion? Oh, boy. Oh, good. Hello, Melinda. I'm glad you guys... that there is life out there in the universe. I didn't put you all to sleep. Of course, it's a big universe. There'd be a lot of people to put to sleep. I know they're not all not all watching me at the moment. But so again, particularly with Christianity, science and religion, or magic and religion, excuse me, tend to be seen as inherently conflict today. Other religions, this isn't actually true of. Judaism, while it technically has the same prohibitions against against magic as Christianity, has Kabbalah, which gets pretty darn magical. There's also theurgy, which is a branch of magic that is based in religion. There are other religions in the world that have much strong, Taoism and certain branches of Buddhism have fairly good relationships with the magical perceptions in their part of the world. And the thing is, in Christianity, the idea of magic and religion being mutually exclusive is somewhat new. When you read even one of the worst books written, Malleus Maleficarum, which is a whole book about hunting down and burning witches at the stake. The funny thing is, it acknowledges that there's another type of magic in the world. There's what it calls natural magic in the world. That there's a type of magic that works based on natural law that is not demonic in nature and is not inherently evil. The thing is, through the Middle Ages, there was an ongoing debate about the relationship between natural magic, where you relied on, which in many ways, from what my understandings and readings, seems to essentially be science, because you're talking about herbs, you're talking about other practices that actually work by natural law. That's at the time may have seemed magical. There's the old thing about there's an old argument I've seen, and it's I think a good argument about how the modern farmer goes out to his field and spreads cow manure. The ancient might have gone out and spread the blood of a chicken. Yeah, and yes, as Drew mentioned in an early episode, the church in the medieval era did actually summon demons to defend themselves learn how to defend themselves. Church necromancy and demon summoning is something I'll get into in a minute. But you spread the blood of a sacrifice over the field. And it still comes down to you're basically fertilizing the field. You give somebody an herb, because they have a tummy ache and now they feel better, it may be perceived as magic at the time. What's actually going on is basically science. The concern the church had is that, well, what's the difference between the two, and how do we know when somebody's using natural means or using demons to do magic? As Melinda pointed out in the chat, and Drew has mentioned previously, there was a whole school of thought through the Middle Ages of summoning demons for religious purposes. Most prominently, this came with Pope Honorius, who actually supposedly wrote an entire grimoire for summoning demons. The story going that he was so pious that basically he had tried and bested all of the natural temptations, so he wanted to see what else. It's like, oh, okay, I'm above all of the earthly temptations. What else you got, Satan? There are a number of various figures. I'll talk. In fact, I'll have to get into Saint Theophilus at this point in a second. But for that matter, there was a very strange practice that boggles my mind, at least, of people who were possessed by demons, who the church would send around. Particularly, this happened around the incident in Ladune. But basically, the church would send these demon-possessed, usually women, out with an exorcist to keep an eye on them, because it was believed because they were possessed, they had the ability to see into purgatory and they could find out things about the spirits there. Not that I would particularly recommend this method to anyone, but it was a thing. For that matter, another good example of all excuse me, at this point would be the Black Mass. The Black Mass started, the idea of doing mockery of the Roman Catholic Mass as a satanic ritual. Well, actually, the Black Mass, the using urine and feces as the Eucharist, the inverted crucifix, the doing liturgy backwards, started with Catholic priests, and it wasn't meant to summon the devil or even worship the devil. It was basically a love spell. Used in the courts of King Louis the 14th, to make people fall in love with each other. Again, this isn't something I necessarily recommend, but it did actually happen. So, okay, I think the last thing I want to say on this subject is Saint Theophilus of Adana, aka Saint Theophilus the Penitent. Saint Theophilus let me look up when he was, to be precise, because it's always good to be precise. But he's one of the stranger Catholic saints. So he died in 583 AD. So we'll talk more as time goes on about the idea of selling your soul to the devil for power. Most people know this either through the legend of Dr. Faust, or through, of course, the folktale of the legendary blues musician. Yeah, I bet he can. Robert Johnson. But the earliest it's as far as anyone can tell, the earliest recorded account of somebody selling their soul to the devil comes from 583 AD. And Theophilus. So Theophilus was supposedly a very pious man who was up to be bishop. His problem was that he was, being a very pious and very humble man, he didn't want the position of bishop. So he turned it down. And his main rival got the job instead. Theophilus was very unhappy about this. He was Turkey. He was unanimously elected bishop. He turned it down. and or I'm sorry, he wasn't a rival. Another guy gets the position in his stead, and strips Theophilus wrongly of his position of archdeacon of Adana, Sicilia. Um, and he regretted the choice. So he supposedly sought out a necromancer to contact the devil. The devil insisted that in return for his help, Theophilus renounced Christ and the Virgin Mary in a contract signed in his own blood. Theophilus signed, and the devil gave him the position as bishop. Later on in his life, he became very fearful of the whole thing and terrified about the state of his soul, and he repented and he prayed to the Virgin Mary for forgiveness. The story goes, 40 days of fasting and prayer, the Virgin Mary appeared before him and chastised him. Not surprisingly. He begged for forgiveness, and Mary promised to intercede with God. He fasted another 30 days, and Mary appeared before him again to give absolution. And the devil wasn't so happy about giving up the soul. 3 days later, he woke up to find the contract on his chest. He took the contract to the legitimate bishop, confessed what had happened, and the bishop burned the contract. And supposedly he died out of sheer joy. There are variations on this. Supposedly he did it out of jealousy. Often the necromancer is specifically referred to as being a Jew. Sometimes there's no necromancer or magician. He just makes the deal on his own. Sometimes he repents the day after, when the bishop apologizes. Mary appears immediately after he begins to pray. Sometimes Mary doesn't appear at all, and just the contract just shows up the next morning or 40 days after. Sometimes the devil offers him money, and then as part of his repentance, the money is given to the poor. But yeah, this is probably the oldest version of selling your soul to the devil. Certainly it has religious connotations in the Bible, just because of the devil offering Jesus dominion over the world in return for worship. And there are various other people that are supposed to have done it. We'll get... the list is fairly long, and some of the stories are very interesting, so we'll wind up getting into this another day. I would definitely recommend checking out the music of Robert Johnson. He's an amazing musician who's famous for having sold his soul. And supposedly dying, and the devil got to claim it, but you can look all that up. So that's the weird history, a bit of the weird history and relationship between magic, science, and religion. We're hitting about an hour and a half. Does anybody got any questions, comments, concerns? Again, for those of you who are tuning in more later, I do apologize for having to skip last week. We will have a pre-recorded interview up, hopefully sometime this week, to make up for it. And then remember, well, I don't know what we're doing. The plan is to have a live episode on Halloween night. Because once we upload the pre-recorded episode, and I do one the night before Halloween will be our 50th episode. And that's why I'm doing the special one on Halloween. I'm also off Halloween, so I'll have time to just run with it. So I'll figure... Whatever it's going to be is a surprise, mostly because I haven't figured it out yet. I've got a bunch of interviews I'm lining up. A couple of authors. Some other nifty things coming up. So stick around, stay tuned. Like, comment, subscribe. But I think we're actually probably pretty good for the night. I do have to work tonight after all. So I'm going to get going. Thanks everybody for listening, for subscribing, for helping support us. we're doing really well right now. We've got 129 subscribers. No, actually, Serenity, no, I'm actually on top of it pretty well at the moment. I've got a couple of interviews I'm in the process of lining up now from people that are actually getting back to me. There's probably close to half a dozen other emails I have floating in the wind at the moment. I'm hoping to hear responses about, but no, I have specific ones I'm actually in the process of scheduling. Um, Thanks to the one publisher or the one lady who I've published on. I've had a couple of authors that she's worked with on the show, and not sure off the top of my head which ones you're talking about, but no, I've got at least I think three or so, maybe more interviews I'll be scheduling in the near future. Possibly one for Sunday if she's available. And have more details when we get closer to that. Um, there's a bunch more people I need to call and get in contact with. For that matter, if anybody knows somebody that they think would be a good interview subject, feel free to give them my email, kevinm.paranormalencyclopedia@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to talk with them if somebody's watching this and you think you'd make a good choice. Again, feel free to email me and we can talk about it. But that's it for now, folks. Everyone have a good night, and I'll see you next week.